My name is Matt, and some of you folks know my story, and for those of you who don't, I did grow up here at Hudson. I was raised and confirmed here. In the summer of 1995, the year I was confirmed, actually, my family and I left to go to another church, and after college and some traveling around, I moved back home to Raleigh and rejoined Hudson in the spring of 2013. What I'm trying to say is, right there where you're sitting, I also sat and daydreamed and fantasized about what I was going to eat for lunch. So, if you doze off while I'm speaking, I understand. Try not to snore too loudly. I also understand the peril of a son of a faith community coming home to preach there. When Jesus went back to his faith community, they literally tried to throw him off a cliff. So, if I leave here alive, I'll consider it a success today. And if you hate what I'm saying, you can direct all your angry emails to Debbie. She's going to field those for me. And also, I'm just thankful there aren't many cliffs in Raleigh. So it's Mother's Day, and I brought my mom here. Many of you remember her as the former children's choir director, assistant choir director. She took on a lot of roles back then. I also brought my mother-in-law and the mother of my furry baby, also known as my wife. All three of them are in equally important roles, and I'm thankful that all three of them are exceptionally good at those roles. So today I want to celebrate all the women who've faithfully taken on those roles and have helped to shape the lives of children, children-in-law, and furry babies of the world. I also want to acknowledge the women who, for whatever reason, are unable to have children-in-law, and furry babies. I want to acknowledge the space that's there, if it's there, and also to affirm the full humanity of all women, regardless of their status as biological mothers or whatever. For many of us, we can say without condition that we have the greatest moms who ever lived. Our experience of our mothers was overwhelmingly positive. We have a hard time finding anything critical to say about our moms. For others of us, our experience of our moms was negative. We experienced perhaps an absentee or an abusive mother. When we think about mothers, all kinds of pain and anxiety are dredged up. Either way, I want to acknowledge the great influence that mothers have in this world, the capacity for and the potential to create both great suffering and great joy in the world. And I want to celebrate mothers like my own who take that responsibility seriously, with great care and compassion, and pass on a world full of love, grace, and joy, instead of one full of brokenness and alienation. Now, mothers across the world have often gotten a bum rap in our dime store self-help culture. And prevailing psychological and emotional development theories have been widely misinterpreted by lay practitioners in the process of self-diagnosis. For instance, Freudian attachment theory says a person's emotional and psychological health is primarily shaped by their primary caregiver, which can be a mother, but it can also be a father, a grandparent, or other kind of guardian. Bowen family systems theory says a person's emotional and psychological health is overwhelmingly shaped by the entire family system in which that person was raised, including parents, siblings, extended family, and friends. One of the pitfalls of engaging these theories without the guidance of a therapeutic professional is they can make it very easy for people to wallow in their own self-pity without taking then responsibility for their own behaviors in life. Now, mourning the broken relationships in our lives is incredibly good and healthy. But when that mourning and processing turns to wallowing, it becomes counterproductive. We become like robots, resigned to our predestined programs of suffering eternally, and thus contributing to the suffering of those around us, or like puppets who only react to the strings pulled by our family systems. No more and no less. Our lives become slaves to the past, summarily encapsulated by wounds inflicted upon us by our parents and grandparents and guardians. So this leads us, of course, to the kingdom of Judah. Now, the kingdom of Judah in the 7th century BCE had gotten very, very rich. They had shifted from a bartering economy to one based on currency. This one shift alone helped to centralize the power and wealth in the country, and so the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Now, when the Assyrian Empire initially colonized Judah, they left the rich and powerful Judahites in place. And these wealthy Judahites, well, they kept on getting richer and more powerful. What's more is the temple priests in Jerusalem were also getting rich. They were jacking up temple taxes and extorting the poor in exchange for religious services. It's sort of like if Mac or Debbie were charging $1,000 every time they went to visit someone in the hospital, which thankfully they don't do. But that's what the priests were doing in Jerusalem. And the thing is, the rich were able to pay those extortions, while the poor weren't. Because they had the money, the wealthy elite of Judah were able to maintain the covenant law by buying their way through it. Now, I want to note here and be very clear that the problem was not that the Judahites were wealthy. The problem was how the Judahites were using their wealth. Have you ever known anyone who tithed huge amounts of money to a church, but when you got to know them, you realized the money they gave was just a drop in the bucket for them, and they were somehow completely missing the point of what church is? In a sense, they were trying to buy their way into the kingdom of heaven. This was Ezekiel's world. He was a wealthy elite priest from Jerusalem who witnessed firsthand the excesses of his society. He saw the way the wealthy ignored the weak and the poor and the outcast, and he was disgusted. And in 597 BCE, the Babylonian Empire came to town. And when they came to town, they destroyed everything, including the temple. And they took captive all the wealthy and powerful Judahites, including Ezekiel. And while in exile, these wealthy Judahites complained about the loss of their fortune. Literally, the loss of their fortune. That's what they were complaining about. They had a saying among them, which was a common idiom throughout the ancient Near East. The parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. And what they meant by that was that clearly Yahweh was punishing them for something their parents and grandparents had done. They did not want to take responsibility for their own actions, ignoring orphans and widows, oppressing the weak and the poor, and instead they were hopelessly resigning themselves to their own fates, because to them, clearly, that's the way Yahweh works. To them, it was conceivable that Yahweh would dispassionately punish an entire generation of people as a consequence of things their parents and grandparents did. To them, God was fundamentally angry and vengeful. Now, there are people today in the world who treat the people around them horribly and are either unwilling or unable to accept responsibility for those actions because they see themselves as being always a victim of their parents' actions. Like, for whatever reason, they can't seem to internalize the fact that God is not punishing them, that they don't have to punish themselves and those around them, that they're not pre-programmed robots or puppets on a string. And so because they believe they're being punished, they go around punishing those around them. For this, Ezekiel speaks, and he says to the people, stop using that idiom. God doesn't work like that. God is not fundamentally angry and vengeful. All lives are God's, and no one is resigned to a fate of someone else's making. God's grace and love comes to all, and everyone has a choice to either treat others well or to treat them poorly. And everyone will reap the consequences of their own actions in this world, not the actions of someone else. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, takes up Ezekiel's torch right here when he says that God will repay according to each one's deeds. Paul goes on to make clear that these consequences affect everyone, not just the faithful Jewish. And so we can't complain in that sense about God's unfairness. God shows no partiality, he says, in the administration of consequences. In other words, God is not in the business of punishing children for their parents' sins. God enters the pattern of inherited sin, robs it of its power, and gives each generation a fresh slate, a clean opportunity to go around loving our neighbors. But you see, this is problematic for me because we know that some people who do good things throughout their lives are made to suffer undeservedly, and we know that other people who do bad things throughout their lives are unjustly rewarded for their evil actions. We know this. We see it happen all the time. We know that some loving, selfless people die young and poor, and some greedy, self-centered people live long, comfortable lives. So how do we square this with what Ezekiel and Paul are saying? Does it mean everyone is deserving of all the bad things that happen to them? Can we do something in order not to suffer in life? But you see, all of those questions are predicated on one concept, that the suffering in this life is caused by God. It would be very easy to read both of these passages, both in Ezekiel and in Paul's letter, and get that God is fundamentally the cause of our suffering. I fundamentally reject that principle. I reject that premise. I do not think Ezekiel and Paul are saying that God will punish each person for the bad things they do. I think Ezekiel and Paul are saying that there are consequences to our actions that are built into the cosmos, into the world, that are natural and aren't necessarily the work of God's intention. And we all need to learn, in some sense, how to go about accepting this as part of life. This is not fatalism either. This is not throwing our hands up to the winds of fate. It's being honest with ourselves about the complicated and contingent nature of human life. The good is mixed in with the bad is mixed in with the good, and we get to influence some of it. God is not the author of our suffering, but God is also not absent in our suffering. God moves with us through our suffering and our joys throughout our lives. There's something else going on here. Ezekiel says, "The righteousness of the righteous shall be on the righteous." Now, righteousness as a concept has been horribly misunderstood by the modern Western mind. We often think, in 21st century America or in the West, we often think of righteousness in terms of abstract moral principles. If you do what is right, then you're righteous, and if you do what is wrong, then you're not. But you see, this removes righteousness from its Hebrew context, which is always referring to the covenant relationship. For the Hebrews, there was no such thing as doing good in an abstract, individualistic way. Whenever the writers of the Old Testament reference doing good, they're always referring to doing what is right in the context of a relationship. So righteousness then, in the Hebrew mind, means being in right relationship with others. It means loving our neighbors as ourselves. What's more, Ezekiel emphatically rejects the notion that someone can be in right relationship with God without being in right relationship with their neighbors. Remember, the elite wealthy Judahites were following the letter of the covenant law. They were sacrificing and fasting and praying and checking all the boxes required by the religious authorities. But in doing so, they were also oppressing the poor and the marginalized. They were giving huge sums of money to the temple priests. And at the same time, they were ignoring the plight of the widows and orphans and aliens. We must take responsibility for how we treat other people in our society. We don't get to pawn off that responsibility onto generations past or to generations future. We may suffer some in this life and we may not. But either way, the righteousness of the righteous is on the righteous. God did not create robots or puppets. Robots and puppets are created by humans, and they do whatever the human operating them tells them to do. God created human beings with actual agency and great capability to either love or hate our neighbors, the earth. Sure, we get it wrong a lot, but that doesn't wash away our responsibility in this world. By the way, this is not about human responsibility and salvation. In the end, our Reformed theology teaches us that through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ alone, God loves us all and saves us all. But that same Reformed theology teaches us that our proper response is responding to this, is that God gives us all the capacity to choose how we're going to live in this world. God is ultimately responsible for the kingdom of heaven finally coming to earth. But God gives humans responsibility in the meantime to make the earth look like that kingdom of heaven, however imperfectly. And in that, we cannot avoid responsibility because the righteousness of the righteous is on the righteous. Amen.